This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Verso Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is The Feminist and the Sex Offender, Confronting Sexual Harm, Ending State Violence by Judith Levine and Erica R. Miners. In the era of Me Too and mass incarceration, The Feminist and the Sex Offender makes a powerful feminist case for accountability without punishment, and sexual safety and pleasure without injustice. With analytical clarity and narrative force, The Feminist and the Sex Offender contends with two problems that are typically siloed: sexual and gender violence on the one hand, and the state's unjust, ineffective, and soul-destroying response to it on the other. Drawing on interviews, extensive research, reporting, and history, The Feminist and the Sex Offender develops an intersectional feminist approach to ending sexual violence. It maps with considerable detail the unjust sex offender regime while highlighting the alternatives we urgently need. The Feminist and the Sex Offender, Confronting Sexual Harm, Ending State Violence by Judith Levine and Erica R. Miners. Out now from Verso Books. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. Last month, Jeff Bezos sent an email to Amazon employees, reporting from Amazon's S-Team, which I didn't know what that meant, so I looked it up on Google. It means Senior Leadership Team. Subject heading, Juneteenth. Quote, over the past few weeks, the STEAM and I have spent a lot of time listening to customers and employees and thinking about how recent events in our country have laid bare the systemic racism and injustices that oppress Black individuals and communities. This Friday, June 19th, is Juneteenth, the oldest known celebration commemorating the end of slavery in the U.S. I'm canceling all of my meetings on Friday, and I encourage all of you to do the same if you can. We're providing a range of online learning opportunities for employees throughout the day. Please, take some time to reflect, learn, and support each other. Slavery ended a long time ago, but racism didn't. The woke missive was signed simply Jeff, in the informal style characteristic of our society's most powerful and deeply hierarchical institutions. Warehouse workers and contract drivers, of course, didn't have any white-collar meetings to cancel. They had hard, low-paid, and insecure work to do, keeping this country's private full-spectrum logistics monopoly running smoothly under the watchful gaze of management's techno-tailorist behavior surveillance dystopia. And so instead, many warehouse workers were encouraged to wear Black clothing. The whole thing, of course, struck some Black Amazon workers as outrageous. Quote, what does a Black shirt do for anybody in terms of social justice? Adrienne Williams, a contract driver, told the New York Times. Better pay, she said, quote, would cut down the pre-existing condition that is poverty. The shameless corporate attempts to co-opt Black Lives Matter might raise concerns for some that identitarianism is inevitably leading the movement into a neoliberal corporate diversity dead end. But what the Amazon episode reveals is that the opposite is in fact true. The radical activists at the lead of this movement have made the materialist anti-racist demand to defund police their priority. When sadistically profiteering companies like Amazon seek to channel that movement into the realm of abstraction, guilty white penance, executive multiculturalism, and ideational discrimination, organized people in what is now the largest protest movement in U.S. history push back, and they exploit the contradictions to push this anti-racist moment in yet more radical directions. This movement forces companies like Amazon on the defensive, and their pathetic defenses, in turn, provide Amazon workers like Adrienne Williams an opportunity to do an imminent critique of Jeff Bezos and Amazon and the contradictions of their corporate diversity discourse and politics. This brings me, of course, to the book White Fragility by corporate diversity consultant Robin DiAngelo. Obviously, on some level, it is depressing as all hell that this book, informed by DiAngelo's experience being hired by bosses to make white workers engage in criticism, self-criticism sessions on their deep, bad, racist feelings. It's depressing that this has been on the New York Times bestseller list for 14 weeks. But what we're seeing is not a street movement that's empowering woke corporate neoliberalism. Rather, this movement and this moment are challenging neoliberalism at its securitized, cop, prison, border-intensive core. And so, of course, unsurprisingly, what we're seeing is the hegemonic system's woke response. Here we are with a radical left-wing anti-racist movement driving the agenda, being met with corporate wokeism on the one hand and Trump's most blood-and-soil white culture war on the other. We can fight both, and we are. This episode is my interview with Jared Loggins and Wendy Muse on what to read instead of White Fragility. It's an unusual dig episode because instead of being about one book, it is about a lot of books. 10 books, to be precise. Before we get started, this podcast is, of course, supported by book publishers and whatnot who advertise items that might be perfect for dig listeners like you. But the bulk of our funding comes directly from dig listeners like you who contribute your financial support at patreon.com/thedig. If you have not contributed yet, and you can afford to do so, please take one moment now, press pause if you must, to navigate your web browser to patreon.com/thedig. We also, if you contribute at least $10 a month, will send you a left-wing book or books in the mail as a thank you. That's patreon.com/thedig. patreon.com/thedig. We do appreciate it, and this podcast does depend on it. Thank you. Okay, here's Jared Loggins and Wendy Muse. Jared Loggins is a political theorist of black politics and a PhD candidate at Brown University. He is the author, with Andrew Douglas, of Prophet of Discontent, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Critique of Racial Capitalism, a forthcoming book on King and his critique of racial capitalism. They explore parallels between King and the black radical tradition by arguing that at the heart of King's growing dissatisfaction with American society was an emergent critical theory that sought to expose the maddening entanglements between racism and the logic and practice of capital accumulation. Wendy Muse is a PhD candidate in history at NYU, where she is completing her dissertation on the impact of multiracial leftist networks forged between Brazil and Lusophone African nations during the Cold War. She is also the creator of Left Pocket Project and podcast, which brings you the history of leftists of color one swipe at a time. I will include a link to that in the show notes. I will also include in the show notes links to any book discussed in this interview and links to any relevant dig episodes. Jared Loggins, welcome to The Dig, and Wendy Muse, welcome back.
Hi.
Thank you for having me.
To start out, why are so many people reading White Fragility right now, and what does that reveal about a sort of like liberal race politics that I think is experiencing a moment of crisis, but is still in some ways very hegemonic?
The first thing is, I just want to get this out of the way, first of all. White fragility is a phrase that was used by Black people for a really long time. And I noticed that the author of White Fragility actually says in the book that she coined the term. So I think that pretty much gets the ball rolling for the problems with the book right off the bat. But I think it's something that is somewhat comfortable for people to start off reading, and that includes potentially Black people as well. Obviously, like Black people are going to be more familiar with the issues of racism because we face them daily. But I think sometimes that approach where it's more about diversity and inclusion as opposed to direct confrontation, not only with the people you would consider like oppressors, but also the self. I think that sort of eases us into discussing things in a way that's more comfortable. And so obviously, if this is your first rodeo where you're discussing issues of race and police brutality and whatnot for the first time, and I should be more clear, racism, not just race. If you're discussing those for the first time, something like this is a nice sort of padded room for you to get comfortable in and not be quite as confrontational. And so I think that's just like the first off reason. And the other reason I think is because people like to hear things from those who make them feel most comfortable. And I think in this case, because D'Angelo herself is white, it's a much easier, I think it's approachable for some people in ways that perhaps a book that was written by a person of color, a Black person in particular, may not be.
So McKinsey, the management consulting firm, they sort of released this sort of diversity report right before, White Fragility goes to press in 2018. Among other things, they say that diverse and inclusive companies basically have a sort of competitive advantage, right? They're more likely to, as they put it, outperform on profitability metrics over companies that are not diverse. And so what this tells us is that, there is a sort of imperative, among these companies to sort of pursue a certain kind of sort of anti-racist or anti-sexist discourse. And it's very much sort of entangled in, a kind of corporate viability and in the pursuit of profit. And so, if companies are looking to, sort of bring into the workplace, these sort of trainers and training manuals that can sort of speak to prevailing liberal norms about racism, at root a set of psychological dispositions, right, a sort of matter of the heart, or, racism as sort of solvable through a kind of individual atonement, they will have found a kind of guidance in a book like White Fragility. And also, these corporations will have also found, appealing in White Fragility, the sort of remarkably narrow account of racism that sort of deflects attention from the ways that corporate power, has sort of been centrally involved in the reproduction of racial disregard through dispossession, wealth hoarding, and so on. And so in this way, we can see these sort of diversity consultants, not simply as trying to facilitate, a kind of workplace kumbaya, or whatever you want to call it. They're also sort of doing a kind of crisis management, for, these corporations who would very much like for racism and gender depression to sort of only be about attitudes, which is to say, not about capitalism, right? So this is, one way of sort of thinking about these sort of cascading of these like corporate statements in support of Black Lives Matter, right? In the last few weeks, right? There's this sort of potential crisis that corporate boardrooms believe, right, can sort of be resolved by sort of supporting diversity and inclusion, leaning into diversity and inclusion. But, the problem is that, the sort of dissonance is sort of pretty obvious, right? So like take Amazon, for example. This is the same company that, in one corner of the mouth is like, we support anti-racism, Black Lives Matter, but it's the same company that sort of fired and harassed, a Black worker at a distribution center in Long Island for basically, demanding better working conditions.
And had like a media strategy to stigmatize him as like inarticulate.
That's right. And so, what we've got is like diversity and commitments to anti-racism coming from above, but then we have exploitation sort of crushing the workers below, right? And a book like, White Fragility actually cannot possibly put us in a position to sort of respond to this sort of reproduction of racialized vulnerability.
Two things really stick out to me about the book, which obviously I haven't read and don't plan on reading. One is this kind of the idea that racism will be solved through this ideational work of white people doing kind of self-help, self-transformation work on themselves, and then two, this, and both of you have touched on both of these, is that this emphasis on diversity at the upper echelons of workplaces rather than dealing with the racism embedded in the boss-worker relationship, let alone like talking about diversity, how these sort of consultants never seem to emphasize the diversity that would come from the unfinished fights to desegregate schools and neighborhoods.
One of the sort of problems here too is that like, and by the way, speaking of like all this talk now about not reading Marx, he actually gives us a sort of profoundly sort of, important formulation, which is that all of our sort of human relationships under capitalism are sort of mediated by exchange. This is all the way down. And they're mediated by exchange in such a way that like, it's not simply that, we can get together, and simply treat each other in the right kinds of ways. So it's that, the fact that we cannot treat each other in the right kinds of ways is sort of hamstrung, in the sort of Marx parlance by the fact that we live in a world that sort of fetishizes commodities. And so to some extent, this sort of morality actually fails us in the sense that we can be perfectly upstanding, and we would still be sort of structurally compelled to pursue the competitive advantage, to sort of jockey for position, to gentrify neighborhoods, to disinvest in neighborhoods at our discretion. And ultimately, like we would continue to sort of think ultimately in terms of exchange, so we have to find a way to sort of upend what Martin Luther King Jr. called a sort of thing-oriented society. And we cannot sort of upend this sort of thing-oriented society until we get clear about what sort of structurally prevents us from doing that, and that's capitalism.
It sort of feels like the book itself is also a microcosm of what we're seeing happening with some of the protests as well. And so one of the things that I remember seeing is that, and even hearing people call into shows and whatnot to talk about white people in particular, we're saying things like, I live in a predominantly white neighborhood. I live in a wealthy, predominantly white neighborhood. We're having a little protest to get together. I'm the only one. What should I do? Right? I've heard people asking these questions on talk shows and asking them online and things like that. And it makes me just kind of stop and say, okay, it's great that they're protesting. It's great that they're doing something. But then the larger question becomes, well, why do you live in a segregated neighborhood in the first place? Like,
yes.
Why do you go to a segregated school? Why do you have no Black friends? I think in particular, COVID has also kind of put this under the microscope, because what we saw, at least in the beginning, the earlier stages of the virus, was that wealthier people were bringing it into the country by virtue of just being more likely to travel. But then we saw greater infection rates and deaths among people of color, and particularly poor people of color who were working at the front lines. And so we have this disconnect, because you then say, okay, wait a second, these social groups are not overlapping. And so I think with books like White Fragility, and again, I also have not read it, but I'm familiar with her message. I've seen her give talks and things like that online, and some podcasts and whatnot. I don't think that the intentions are necessarily bad, but at the end of the day, the intentions don't matter. And you have to look at it structurally, which is something that Jared has also touched on quite a bit. And if the structure doesn't match institutionally, if we don't have a match to the sort of personal and interpersonal dynamic, then it doesn't really play out the way that I think some people want it to. I also find that there's this constant self-flagellation or self-flagellative aspect to the book, which is kind of interesting, and I think falls in line with the way we handle a lot of social issues in this country, in the sense that, as long as you yourself are purified of any sin, right, then you can throw the first stone, to be honest. And so I think that some people feel like once they've done the quote unquote work by reading this book and by questioning their own interpersonal forms of racism or bias, then they've done all they need to do. They don't have to go further than that, because they don't need to tear the whole church down. They just need to be a good member of the congregation. And so I think that also becomes a part of the problem with the book and why it's not connecting with the structural side of things.
Yeah, and instead of taking concrete political action and examining their place within the world in that way, I think a lot of liberal whites will be probably reaching out to the very few Black people they know, if they know any, to impose extremely weird conversations on them.
Yeah, and I've gotten some of those. Messages, actually. And and to be completely honest, I am upfront with the way I feel about it, but I think I applaud people for taking the steps. Right. So I don't want to completely discourage them.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I emphasize in these responses responses to such emails that I need you to go beyond just sending me an email, right? Like consider where you live, consider your friend group, consider where you spend your money, who you vote for, et cetera. It has to go beyond just like you sending me a nice email or white people being nice to people of color in general. It has to go deeper than that. And I think perhaps the onus might be on us as people, like on people of color, which is something I don't like to say, but it might be on us to kind of lay out what that looks like, because I think some people are so lost, but I think they have it in their hearts in this case to do the right thing. And I think we have to sometimes put those breadcrumbs down for them to get the message better.
That being nice reference, being nice to people of color reference just popped Get Out into my head.
Yes.
I would vote for Obama 3 times if I could.
Yeah.
One thing that's interesting about this white fragility D'Angelo phenomenon is that as much, as I just sort of like mocked her book for this emphasis on personal transformation, the left also very much has always wanted to make new people, new subjects, but I think in a very different sort of way, say by organizing a multiracial workplace into a union that advocates for economic and racial justice instead of, encouraging guilty white liberals to, quote, work on themselves. I don't want to toss out this idea of remaking people and how they are in the world. How do you distinguish, Jared, the distinction between the sort of purely ideational liberal approach and the left project?
We should, in many ways, we're trying to sort of model this in the podcast today, which is to sort of like read and center, the sort of work that's already sort of been done to sort of think through the relationship between racism and capitalism, and by sort of turning to the Black radical tradition, by thinking about the sort of long history of Black radicalism. In other words, by sort of coming up, I guess, with sort of different ancestors, right? Like what would it mean to sort of begin with the story about, the sort of left as sort of having its origins or sort of being at its most vibrant by centering someone like Hubert Harrison or Du Bois, or something like the Institute of the Black World or the Republic of New Africa, or some of these other sort of radical left Black projects. And to do that would mean that, the left would have to take seriously the way that, sort of Black radical subjects have been sort of at the heart of thinking about and mobilizing against what has been so deeply problematic about capitalism, which is the sort of exposure of Black and brown people in particular, but poor people generally, to a kind of vulnerability to premature death. And that tradition is already there. So I sort of am inclined to say that part of what needs to happen is a kind of, that we have to do some sort of epistemic kind of intellectual work to sort of just lay out, the sort of tradition that is already there for us, if we're willing to sort of just find it and think with it.
Wendy, it seems like there's this kind of interrelated problem that Jared's pointing out. On the one hand, there's the left, especially white people on the left, not emphasizing the Black left tradition within the left in the U.S. as core to the left history in the U.S., a history of Black leftism without which the history of the American left is impossible to think about clearly, would not exist as it does. And then on the other hand, interrelatedly, but distinctly, the liberal anti-racist discourse centering a certain type of Black and multicultural experience, but rendering the Black left invisible as a central part of the Black tradition.
Right. And that's definitely something that obviously I've worked on quite a bit.
Yes.
Just with like the Left Pocket Project, for example, by being frustrated with the liberal side that basically downplays or completely ignores us, or says that all Black people are centrist pragmatists who care a ton about Joe Biden, or what, fill in the blank message that's necessary for electoral politics, while at the same time sort of co-opting the message of people and even the presence of people like Angela Davis to push forth that message, ironically not recognizing that she was like a Marxist-Leninist at one point. So there are moments where I am frustrated by that, but doing my best to get people to read. But I do think, going back just a tad,
Please.
The question about the self, on the one hand, I do want better white people. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
trademark. I want better white people. I want the new white man or the new white woman, because I think at the end of the day, what's important about that, even though that reduces things down to the individual, I think individuals come together for a collective, right? And so once, especially thinking about the ways that Black and people of color, Indigenous people as well, have been alienated by so many left groups and leftists as a whole because of racism, right? And we're going to talk about this in some of the books that we're going to be discussing today, but how that history has also been harmful and damaging to the progress of leftism, especially in a place like the United States. So on the one hand, I do think that it is important for people to work on themselves. But I think what's frustrating about that is that there aren't enough, I think, coming together as a collective. Like once you work on yourself, then what? There's a disconnect between like the personal and the collective action. And so I wonder, I think it's the left's job then to not only instill the importance of individual work, but then also to talk about how that extends beyond the personal and goes into the structural, goes into how, as I said before, how you vote, where you live. I think also the kind of work that you do as well. Like if you're working on Wall Street, reject your job. If you're working as a police officer, reconsider what you're doing. Fight for the opposite side. Fight for the people that you are actively oppressing. And even things like areas where all three of us are involved in some way in academia, kind of questioning those too. And I think using your jobs or your positionality in the world in a way that's subversive to help and to be on the side of people who are being oppressed within it. So I think that's a way to kind of do that.
And one other interesting thing too about this is that so like D'Angelo sort of bills herself as sort of coming out of the sort of whiteness, sort of critical whiteness studies tradition, but she actually is quite at odds with the sort of arguments that someone like Noel Ignatieff or David Roediger make, right, about the abolition of whiteness and what's actually required of individual white people to sort of upend capitalism. And so it actually sort of fits nicely with what Wendy is saying about like, it's not just personalized, sort of privatized story. It also involves a sort of abolition or kind of reimagining of the sort of structures that reproduce whiteness.
Let's get into the books that people should be reading instead of White Fragility. You each brought 5, and I want to start with a book that I did an episode on, which is Blacks in and Out of the Left by Michael Dawson. Wendy, you suggested this book. Why is this book important? What are some of the key issues that emerge when we look at the history of the role of Black leftists and how they've related to the broader U.S. left?
Mm-hmm. I should say first off that like my list, it was really hard to put together a list of 5. So I hate you for that, Daniel. It was so complicated, especially considering, I have to read a lot for, a doctoral work, and then I'm reading a lot for Left POC, and I'm reading a lot just in general and learning so many things in the process. And so it's very difficult to just pick 5.
These aren't the best 5 necessarily. These are 5 that Wendy thought would be useful at this moment.
Right. And there are 5 that I chose because there were certain things that I wanted to emphasize. Like when you asked us to pick 5, I said, okay, I want to get beyond just the white fragility model, right? And actually choose some things that I think can push us further along, especially for those who might already kind of understand that, hey, racism is bad and police brutality is bad. Like if we can go beyond that. So that I should say that first of all, that this is a list for people who understand that racism and racial capitalism and violence from police are not novel concepts, right? These are generally understood as a problem. It's also a list for people who are searching for sort of better understandings of Black leftism and or a kind of sense of Black autonomy within the movements that we've led and comprised of in the fight for our lives. And I also wanted to create a list that really talked to, I should say, as well, Black people who also wanted to learn more about our contributions to political movements. So this is not just a list for like white people to be less racist, but more of kind of an evolving chunk of books and ideas that are coming from these books that I think can help even people of color and Black people move into a space where we haven't learned about certain things. I know, for speaking for myself, even though I went to XYZ school and whatnot, there were many things missing from my education that I did not learn about my own history and the history of the Black diaspora as a whole until I was well into grad school. So I have to say that these books are things that they cover topics, I should say, that were addressed much later in my life, and that I hope that for many people reading them can introduce them to new concepts that they find helpful. So to answer your question about Blacks in and out of the left, I think it's a really, really, really crucial book for people to read right now, especially because we're on the heels, sort of tail end of the Sanders campaign, and we're going into the general election looking with, like really sad eyes at what's happening altogether. I mean, speaking again for myself, I'm rather depressed about what happened, not just because I'm like a Sanders stan or something, but I think just because that was one moment, sort of glimmer of hope politically for a country that's dead set on literally killing itself right now. So it was a bit frustrating to see his campaign fall apart, but we saw so many of the things repeat themselves that happened in 2016 come around again for 2020. And I think that the Sanders campaign in and of itself is sort of a microcosm, I should say, of some of the problems that Michael Dawson himself addresses in the book. And I just want to bring up a quick example. The other day I was watching the Real News Network, and Marcus Farrell, who is a Sanders supporter and organizer, who's an organizer and campaign staff member on the 2016 campaign, and then he left for the 2020 campaign, but was still generally a supporter of Sanders. But he and several other Black organizers who had worked for the campaign said that there were considerable problems within the campaign, particularly because other Bernie staff members didn't really have a Southern strategy. They didn't listen necessarily to the Black staff members, and that he argued that the Black outreach relied primarily on individuals and not so much on community networks. And he also said basically that he just didn't feel like they were all that interested in listening to and making changes that were significant with regard to getting sort of assembling a Black voter body. And so I think in a lot of ways, this campaign as a political project was out of touch with the realities of the Black community. And I don't mean that to say that like we don't need Medicare for all and we don't need college for all. We need those things. But I think the method of getting there and getting Black people in this country as a larger voting body on board, there were lots of missing pieces that unfortunately the campaign was not quite willing to grapple with. And then as a result of their failures, people I often saw people blaming Black voters, which is not the direction we had gone in previous years. And with regard to other demographics, generally, we don't look at them and say it's their fault that the candidate lost. But we definitely see that a lot with regard to Black voters. But the other thing I think that happened quite a bit was just that there was a downplaying of the importance of identity politics. And when I say identity politics, I'm not saying in the sense that like in the sort of stereotypical neoliberal version that we are often used to hearing about. I'm meaning more to the like back to the roots idea of what identity politics mean in the sense of like the Combahee River Collective version of ID Pol. My point here is that I feel like a lot of the blame was placed in the wrong areas. And it's something that Michael Dawson himself covers quite a bit in the book. This book obviously came out before Bernie Sanders was running for president. It came out in 2013, but it sort of touches on a lot of the unforced errors and in some cases intentional problems that exist on the left. Most notably, one that I think Barbara Ransby has also done a very good job in covering, in that a lot of the time white progressives, even if they're well-intentioned, they're not always on top of things in terms of what is being experienced on the ground by people of color, who are often what we would say reductively, but I think accurately, the canaries in the coal mine for larger structural issues. And we bear the brunt oftentimes of, capitalist overreach. And so to ignore the needs of those groups, and in some cases, what Dawson argues, not only ignore, but to intentionally distort and downplay, because some white progressives and white leftists saw that there was such an integral connection between leftism and the Black community that they felt threatened by it. So I think that there are sometimes aspects of the book where he's basically presenting the white left as the enemy, the direct enemy to Black leftists and Black leftist thought. which is unfortunate, but I think is something that we continue to see repeated into the present by virtue of people who don't necessarily want to address race as a critical issue that's holding people back, or racism as a critical issue that's holding people back from progress in terms of economic equality.
Yeah, really important points that this isn't just about the left doing right by Black people, which of course is a basic moral imperative, but it's like an objective reality, as you say, Wendy, and which Dawson makes clear, and which Mike Davis made clear in my recent interview with him on Prisoners of the American Dream, that the left cannot succeed in the United States without Black struggle at its core. Jared, what's your take?
I was going to sort of add here. I mean, I think Wendy sort of touches on, something that's really important here, which is that it's not self-evident that a kind of sort of anti-racism follows from the social democratic project, which is to say, like, it has to be fought for. The sort of white leftists, a la the Sanders campaign, like, have to actually take seriously, the kinds of vulnerabilities, the kinds of questions that are being raised by Black folks. This is not to sort of do this sort of vulgar identity politics. No, it's actually sort of, as Wendy points out, is actually just sort of a way of getting clear about the specific ways that racial capitalism sort of is sort of borne out in the lives of Black people. Think about where we are now, right? Like, we're in the middle of a pandemic, that has sort of exposed the rot at the heart of the healthcare system. Black people are sort of facing, and just unimaginable kind of death and vulnerability as a result, right? We're sort of in the middle of a sort of ongoing, sort of Black-led uprising against police violence. We're continuing to see Black folks sort of mass warehoused in prisons, right? And it's all raises a question, which is that, what would it mean to sort of take seriously the sort of claims, the grievances, the concerns of Black people? Like, it seems obvious to me that, we should be centering a sort of Black left perspective, in part because, it sort of helps us to sort of helps the left to sort of resolve this kind of, overwrought distinction between anti-racism and anti-capitalism. No, they're intertwined. Mm-hmm. They're intertwined so deeply, and they can't be disentangled. And this was obvious, in the sort of in the history of the Black left. It's obvious. I mean, you take a figure, you take an activist, whether we're talking about someone like Hubert Harrison or Du Bois, or even someone like King, Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer. It was obvious that there was a sort of entanglement between capitalism and racism in such a way that demands that we sort of take seriously their interplay. And it's the Black left that sort of gives us that sort of rich conceptual analysis.
Or Harry Haywood, as Dawson talks about in his book.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Jasson Perez made an interesting point in terms of the Sanders campaign in a recent interview I did with him, Cathy Cohen, and Malaika Jabali, that the campaign really did address the radical demands of Latino movement leaders, and that combined with a really solid Latino organizing strategy was massively successful. And that provides an opportunity for a contrast for the lack of that happening, either in terms of the dialogue with Black radical politics and a Black voter organizing campaign.
Right. I think there are also because I work on Brazil, there are elements of Latin American political organizing that sometimes downplay race and that have a history of downplaying race and emphasizing class that I think sometimes is more legible to people who are coming from that tradition. And so sometimes I've been wondering about that as well. Like, is the language of the Sanders campaign, both in 2016 and somewhat still in 2020, more familiar to people who are coming from Latina political organizing background? It's been a question that's been raised by other activists as well, kind of wondering what failed specifically with Black voters in the U.S. Versus Latino and particularly Latino immigrant populations in the U.S. With the Sanders campaign. I just wanted to add really quickly as well, I think that Dawson does an excellent job just sort of laying out the historiography of the Black left that I think is missing from some of the analysis that we've read, or at least analysis like that of D'Angelo, right? There's not necessarily going to be a connection and such a deep digging because Dawson himself sort of points out what's missing in so many analyses by leftist historians as well, which I think is important for us to think about, because the history that we get from, on the one hand, sort of I would argue, sadly, the anti-racist grift is one that often ignores things like union organizing. It ignores histories of immigrant organizing and things like that I think Dawson's work does emphasize.
And then on the other hand, the sort of white, formerly New Left liberals like Todd Gitlin, who blame Black radicalism for destroying the good project of the early civil rights movement. The next book is Democracy Remixed by Cathy Cohen, which I have not read but am planning on reading. And Jared, you put this on the list, and I want to start by asking you why this book is important, because it's and I'm reading from the synopsis here. It's a book that diagnoses how, quote, young Black Americans today continue to be plagued by low levels of employment, high levels of incarceration, and a profound lack of trust in the government and broader political community. It was published in 2010, after Obama's presidency had made it seem to many that racism was effectively over. Like, the polling on so-called, race relations in this country among white and Black people and others was just like very high at that point. People are like, things are good. But 4 years later, in 2014, BLM erupted from this very contradiction that Cohen was identifying at the time. What did Cohen see that so many observers, pundits, just people were missing at the time?
So the sort of basic point of the book, is that, we can't understand the sort of future, of American politics until we understand, the sort of ways that young Black people, who, sort of have been traditionally sort of left out of political analysis and punditry, sort of take center stage. And Cohen herself is sort of worried that, in the sort of scholarly literature on political behavior and political participation, there's a sort of stunning absence of reflection, observation, thinking with young Black people. And so, there's this sort of simple but sort of profound account at the heart of the book, which is, what do young Black Americans want? What do they desire? What are their political commitments? And so, she's a political scientist. She sort of conducts these sort of surveys after the election of Obama, in which she's sort of asking young Black people sort of series of questions, basically about the status of their lives and their thoughts on American politics. And she finds that many of them are apathetic. Many of them believe that sort of racism, is a sort of enduring, if not impenetrable sort of feature of American politics, which is of course like in opposition to what she also finds, which is that many of the white respondents that she surveys don't have this view at all. They think everything is pretty much rosy, that the election of Barack Obama basically invited in this sort of this kind of post-racial moment. So even there's a sort of disconnect between young black people and young white people that she's sort of taking note of. And then there is a profound distrust that is the sort of result, as she sort of points out, of sort of systematic neglect, of institutional disinvestment, of the fact that so many young Black people just do not feel as if the political leadership is speaking to them. And so by attending to this, this sort of resentment and distrust, she can sort of rightly claim years later, as Black Lives Matter sort of erupts into the streets, following the death of Michael Brown, that these young people actually have every reason, to feel as if their lives are in crisis. They have a reason to be mad at the system. They have every reason to want a sort of dramatic transformation of American society. And so today, and I think thanks in part to Cohen's study, right, it should, sort of surprise no one that much of the vibrant organizing on the ground, is happening in the hands of young Black people, many of them queer and trans people, and, a sort of huge segment of young Black people also happen to be largely supportive of, the social democratic left. And part of that is because I think of a sort of growing dissatisfaction, with the Obama years. The curtain came down, and I think, one, additional lesson, that we can learn from the book is, to follow the lead of young Black people, young Black organizers, which is, there's an article that I think just came out in the Nation by Barbara Ransby, in which she basically makes this argument, right? So much of the sort of vibrant organizing is being led by young Black people. And so what would it mean for the left to sort of take the lead of these young folks who have a very clear and incisive account of the world that they want to see? And one of the things that these young people are sort of pointing out, are identifying, is that by sort of addressing their vulnerabilities, we will all be freer as a result.
Yeah, but I think again, this sort of idea of the canary in the coal mine, I think, comes up. I haven't read Cohen's work, at least this particular work, but I think that's relevant. And I agree on the points that you mentioned with regard to Ransby as well. I think the other thing that's interesting about looking at the protests now in relation to the argument that you just presented from Cohen is the simple fact that, like, I think some people weren't expecting this necessarily. And what we saw was a sort of rejection of, a very, very stark rejection of what I would argue is sort of the class reductionist approach to politics. And I recognize that some people are called class reductionists, I think, unfairly, simply for mentioning economics, which is an important aspect of any sort of discussion of racism in this country or anywhere, right? But I do feel like that reality sort of hit some people in the face who were saying, no, we shouldn't talk about race. It's not that serious. It's not, or we should talk about race only through the message of class because that's more unifying and we don't want to alienate these white people or these white voters. Again, something that Dawson recounts was happening with the CPUSA and others. So it's very frustrating, I think, to kind of, one of the things I'm seeing and experiencing myself, but also that's coming out in all these readings, is that people keep reinventing the wheel. And the wheel has already been made, right? The wheel has been set. There are Black people, there are people of color, there are Indigenous people who are very, very solidly building this wheel that I think people are rejecting. I mean, they're rejecting it because of issues with their own sort of racial chauvinism or nationalism. And it's unfortunate because I would argue, and I think many would agree in the readings and maybe on this panel, I think we would be a lot further along if people would sort of get rid of this sense of racial chauvinism and recognize the message that people who, again, are bearing this very directly, bearing capitalism very directly, what we're saying and what our experiences mean in terms of a larger left politic.
There is, though, also a critique of so-called identity politics that comes from certain corners of the Black left, most notably Adolph Reed, Cedric Johnson. What do you two make of their critique and the extent to which there is a problem with a certain type of identitarianism in aspects of the left and amongst liberals in particular? What do you think they get right? What do you think they get wrong?
But, I think there's a lot of work that Adolph Reed has done that I very much respect, especially a lot of his earlier work where he's critical of the sort of weaponization of identity in a way that's harmful and that takes away from the potential importance of class analysis, right? And I think it's
like Class Notes.
Yes, exactly. I think a lot of the work from that period is crucial. I'm cautioned to respond with regard to some of his contemporary work, which I feel is takes away from the revolutionary potential, or at least underestimates some of the revolutionary potential of young people who are organizing, such as the members of the Democratic Socialists of America who created a People of Color caucus. I think sometimes there's a moment where people who've been in these movements for a while can advise, but also can step back and recognize that perhaps people now aren't doing things exactly as they wish, but that there is still revolutionary potential there and it's taking a new form. But at the same time, I understand and welcome their critiques and understand the place, like where their caution is coming from, because they've seen things that perhaps we haven't, or they've experienced things that we haven't, and they've seen these movements become co-opted and removed from those who really are invested in changing the world.
Jared?
I want to sort of step on the landmine and sort of speak to some of the more like contemporary things that he's sort of been writing about. But I will say that much of the sort of powerful reflections about the relationship between race and class, right? Like Adolph Reed himself is making, right, in the 90s. He himself acknowledges that there is a sort of way that a kind of sort of race-based vulnerability is sort of at the heart of the sort of capitalist project. He acknowledges that. So, I think it's a to sort of see this kind of transition, this sort of shift in his thinking, almost to a kind of class reductionism, is strange to watch.
The next book on the list, Wendy, you suggested, it's Mapping Diaspora by Patricia Pinho. Why is this book important? What do we learn about Black American politics and identity when they are placed in this Pan-American diasporic context?
So in Mapping Diaspora, Pinho talks a lot about this idea of, or this concept of roots tourism, which is a fairly new-ish phenomenon. It's predominantly patronized by people in the U.S. and Europe, Black people specifically, who go to nations that are known as sort of Afro-diasporic sites and explore the local history and try to sort of connect with local people with regard to their culture, religious practices, historical struggle, and the like, and draw connections between themselves and their own struggles in the U.S. or in some cases Europe with those places. And Brazil has become, as of late, one such site, particularly Bahia, the city of Bahia. The state of Bahia, my apologies. And so one of the things that she talks about in particular that I think is important for us to carry into our discussion and also any sort of activism that goes forward is this idea of the baggage that we carry as U.S. Americans into the quote unquote third world, or places that are less developed than the United States socioeconomically. And one of the problems that she draws out is this constant need for Americans to connect while at the same time sort of ignoring significant economic and social privileges and in the process of this exchange. And I think her work is really important for us to keep in mind because we've seen some Black organizations trying to make connections abroad, particularly Black Lives Matter, who has been to Brazil. I believe they went to Sao Paulo, and they've also been to Palestine, among other places where they've tried to forge connections with local activists, which I think were largely successful. But the problem that continues to arise and that I've even directly confronted with regard to some Black Lives Matter activists is that there is a lack of understanding of the histories, the local histories of Black activism or, anti-policing activism, anti-capitalist activism and the like. And unfortunately, sometimes Americans can fall into the trap of seeing our struggle as primordial or the most important while not recognizing that places like Brazil and Black people in Brazil specifically face disproportionate levels of police violence that sort of dwarfs whatever we see here. So if you look at the United States, let's say 100 people are killed a month in the United States as a whole. In Brazil, 100 people will be killed in one tiny city in a week. And so it's important for us to recognize and have perspective when we're having these exchanges. The other thing that I think is important too about her work is that she talks a lot about this problem of the U.S. left and U.S. Black people who are engaging in this roots tourism, sort of freezing in time the occupants or the inhabitants of another country in their struggles, and not recognizing necessarily that they have progressed, they have done things, they have seen change, they have fought for their rights. And instead, we've been in the U.S. falling into this trap of seeing Black people within the diaspora as somehow left behind or sort of frozen in a space where we have advanced 50 years beyond.
Like folkloricized, romanticized, noble, savage kind of thinking.
Exactly. And so it's dangerous. And Spike Lee actually committed this himself. He made the statement that, Black Brazilians are 50 years behind us because they ended slavery later than us. And it's a dangerous trope to fall into. And I think it's one that Patricia and other authors have advised against. And that's important for us, but also incredibly crucial as we expand, I think, necessarily beyond the United States to learn from people in other countries and how we can enact sort of activism in our own communities.
And Wendy, I take it that many of these visitors, U.S. American visitors, are middle or upper middle class Black Americans?
Correct. Yes.
Jared, do you have any thoughts before I ask another question?
I think this is absolutely right. I haven't read the book, but I think there is a kind of impulse in some corners of of sort of black thought to sort of, and black movements to sort of, fall into this trap of American centeredness. And, I sort of think about, what might it mean, sort of just confront the sort of translation problems between the sort of, the sort of struggles that are sort of unfolding in the U.S. context, and struggles that are sort of unfolding elsewhere. And, it just strikes me that one of the things that just needs to happen at the base level is just a kind of deep sort of self-reflection and self-criticism of the ways in which even those of us who sort of embrace and sort of take on a kind of radical politics, oftentimes unwittingly sort of reproduce structures, a kind of structural violence that sort of plays out in a kind of international context. And that just means that we have to sort of confront those contradictions. We have to think about what that means for Black and sort of diasporic movements, global movements at home and abroad.
For either of you, this makes me think about the question of what we can learn from the third worldist Black radical moment of Black power in the entire New Left era, a sort of internationalism that the U.S. left lacks today, but that was so front and center during the moment of global third world decolonization, national liberation struggles.
I mean, it's something that I would like to see revived for sure. But at the same time, what I've seen happening in my own personal experience is the kind of inverse of that. So what I'm seeing more and more is that in Brazil, for example, in universities and among left circles, there's a celebration of people like Angela Davis. There's a celebration of Martin Luther King, of Malcolm X. And there's somewhat of I don't want to say ignorance, because people do know of these local figures, but there's not necessarily the same emphasis on local Black leaders in the Brazilian historical tradition of sorts, in the same way that you see an emphasis of U.S. leaders in the same realm. So that is something that I think will be fascinating and interesting to watch going forward, and what that's going to look like, if there will be a sort of return to the source and an attempt to nationalize this narrative or not. I don't know what to make of it, and I'm somewhat concerned actually about what it means that if people in the U.S. who are movement activists are going abroad, and then at the same time the message they're learning is just sort of a reinscribing of their own histories that's being claimed as a local one, if I'm making sense, right? So Angela Davis is someone who's important to Americans, but she's also important to Brazilians. But then what happens where's the Brazilian Angela Davis? She exists, right? There are people who are local and doing this work, but they're downplayed, they're not heard of, they're not discussed. And I'm concerned about what that means in the long run.
That's a very interesting point, because it makes me think about in a probably mostly positive, but as you're pointing out, Wendy, maybe complex and not entirely positive way, that the current Black Lives Matter uprisings in the U.S. have become a reference point for struggles all over the world, from Europe to Africa to Latin America. And it makes me wonder whether there's this way in which the imperial world system also makes domestic subaltern groups within the metropole of that system, i.e. the United States, a sort of reference point today for third world struggles. Jared, the next book you suggested is Racecraft by Barbara and Karen Fields, who I interviewed about that book, I think maybe like 2 years ago now. Why, just to start out, is this book important?
I sort of recommended this book in part because, I think that, one of the problems that's sort of happening sort of broadly in, sort of liberal circles is, the sort of conflation of race with racism on the one hand, and also this way in which, there's a sort of problem where sort of class sort of critiques get just totally sort of evacuated in analysis of racism. And that's sort of at the heart of their book. They basically make this argument that racism doesn't come from race. Racism creates race, as they say, transforming it from something that an aggressor does into something the target is. And in the book, they give this really nice and I think helpful sort of formulation And they distinguish between race, racism, and what they call racecraft. They say that, the term race sort of stands for the conception of the doctrine that, nature produces humankind into distinct groups, each defined by these different traits, these sort of biological traits. They go on to say that racecraft is the sort of fitting of actual humans into any such grid, right, which inevitably sort of calls for this kind of maneuvering, which they call racecraft. And then racism, refers to the sort of theory and practice of applying a social, civic, legal double standard based on ancestry and so on and so forth. And so the problem, that they go on to identify is that racecraft sort of fixes the illusion of race in a sort of cultural consciousness as a reality, which sort of creates the basis for these sort of many and various oppressions that sort of constitute racism, right? So racecraft, they say, is everywhere. It affects blacks and whites, black and white workers who are sort of exploited by the American capitalist machine. And so for them, the question of race sort of cloaks this sort of much needed issue of tackling, the sort of growing inequality within America. And ultimately, they think that, there's a way in which what they call racecraft sort of inhibits our ability to sort of reckon with the way in which, capitalism is gonna come for us all, especially the most vulnerable among us. And so they are, sort of attending to liberal race discourse that doesn't get us close to sort of addressing the way in which a kind of structural vulnerability that is attendant to capitalism is sort of the specter that hangs over our lives, particularly black and white working people, right? So to some extent, they sort of argue that we're facing a sort of crisis of political energy, right? Because the attention that goes into a kind of racecraft sort of detracts from attention that could be directed at actually addressing the vulnerabilities that are very much a part of racial capitalism. And this sort of gets back to how we started, which is that there is a way in which a sort of focus on the one hand on these sort of individual attitudes and a focus on sort of conflating race with racism actually sort of just gets in the way of our ability to sort of reckon with economic inequality.
It's actually something that I found myself correcting throughout our discussion, because I think that we, at least in popular culture and media, we often see a softening of the term racism, right? It's like a word we cannot use, the journalists cannot use, pop culture cannot use. And so there are all these euphemisms. And I think that the way the book itself kind of plays around with the way that's been done, even in academia and even in more formal spaces, is important. But as I said, it's something that I found myself correcting as we've been discussing it, because I keep saying race or, racial, and I really mean racism. And sometimes I might mean capitalism. And so I've been even conscious of that myself.
My least favorite is race relations. It's like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's like, right, if everyone could just figure out how to get along.
I'm Naomi Klein. You're listening to The Dig, as well you should be, and you can support them on patreon.com.
You definitely know about The Dig since you're listening to this podcast, and you probably know about Jacobin, which helps put out The Dig, but you might not know about Catalyst, a journal of theory and strategy. Capitalism is once again up for debate. Catalyst, a journal of theory and strategy, is a scholarly journal produced by Jacobin Foundation that aims to do everything it can to promote and deepen this conversation. Its focus is, as the title suggests, to develop a theory and strategy with capitalism as its target, both in the North and in the global South. That's an ambitious agenda, but this is a time for thinking big. You can check out Catalyst's great essays, including contributions from scholars like Mike Davis, and subscribe in print for just $20 for an entire year by going to bit.ly/digcatalyst. That's bit.ly/digcatalyst. Wendy, the next book you suggested is another essay collection, Thick by Tressie McMillan Cottom. Why is this book so important?
So I only have positive things to say about this book and the author, of course. So I'll try to keep my fangirling to a minimum. But I really enjoyed this book, primarily because I think she has this uncanny ability to discuss incredibly hard-hitting and difficult topics in a way that has a certain lightness to it, and I think in a way that is accessible for all levels of people approaching this. So I think even people who maybe are less familiar with matters of race and gender and the overlapping concerns of race, class, and gender can read this book and enjoy it. So in other words, I'm saying it's safe for white people, but it's safe for white people in a way that still challenges them. And I think this is another skill that Tressie actually has in sort of sneaking in all of this analysis without you realizing it until you're done with the paragraph, or you're done with the chapter, or you're done with the essay, and then you say, wow, like she talked about classism that she faced as a child, or ableism or racism in a way that I think some people may, you first laugh and then you cry, right? So there's an element to it that's multifaceted, and I think that's why it works really well as a book, not only for just general reading, but also for people to have a better understanding of what intersectionality is. I think that's why it's really important for me, at least, because one of the things I've noticed in recent years is a complete disregard not only for what it means, but I think a diminishing of the value of the idea and the theory. And her book is sort of an embodiment of the way different aspects of oppression can overlap in one's life, in particular as a Black woman, and a Black woman who grew up in certain economic circumstances. And one of the other things I think is important about the book is that she talks about a lot of the sort of quotidian, everyday violence that Black women face. And I think that's often sort of not fully discussed or understood as we talk about violence when it comes from the police, for example. Oftentimes when we discuss police brutality in the United States, unfortunately, the experiences of Black women at the hands of police is downplayed and ignored. And I don't mean just in the sense that, oh, we should talk about it just to like check a notch off, right, or to check a box, but the importance of recognizing, as we've sort of mentioned throughout this discussion, that those who are bearing the brunt of something or a certain issue have to be understood. Their experiences have to be understood for us to sort of work on the larger problem as a whole, as it affects other people as well. So thinking about sexual assault that Black women face at the hands of police, physical violence beyond sexual assault that Black women face at the hands of police, and as we saw even just now with the Breonna Taylor case or the Ayanna Stanley case, or so many other Black women who have been murdered by police, raped by police, there's less of an emphasis on that. And sort of it can help all of us sort of think about what that means and why that absence is a problem, right? If we're talking about improving as a society as a whole, or whatever project we're on right now. I'm unsure. I'm still trying to kind of wrap my head around what is happening right now. And I think all of us are. So anyway, long story short, I think her book sort of introduces a lot of issues that some people may be unfamiliar with, but also it's a nice book for Black women to just read, and women of color in general to read. And I think that we can closely identify with and have affirmation of our experiences, particularly in things like, for example, maternal health, going back. In one of the essays, she discusses her miscarriage and the death of her child as a result of negligence from healthcare professionals. And as someone who almost lost my own child under similar circumstances, it was very difficult to read at the time. But, it's something that a lot of us can connect with and that we face. And I think she sort of creates a space where you feel comfortable, but you also feel activated to do something about the problem that she discusses.
Jared, thinking about what Wendy was just saying about what is gained by digging deeper into the Black experience beyond some sort of monolithic notion that attends to these distinctions of gender, sexuality, class.
I was sort of thinking about there's this in the Meaning of Freedom, which we're gonna talk about. This is the collection of essays that Angela Davis sort of publishes a few years ago. She has this like formulation where she's like, we should think of political solidarity as forming identity rather than identity forming political solidarity. And I think that's a really, really powerful like formulation, like, because it gets at the heart of, what I think is a kind of anxiety about organizing, around gender depression, organizing around racial oppression, organizing around racial capitalism more generally, which is that, it seems to me that it has to start with a set of, concrete political commitments. And, there has to be this sort of serious confrontation with, the fact that, solidarity is hard, and there are going to be tensions, but that is something that we should actually lean into. And I should also say that I don't understand why, left movements generally can't just sort of recognize that it is those who are at the margins, who are the most vulnerable, Black women, Black, queer, and trans people, who can actually tell us something quite profound about what the world should look like. And it is from that point of vulnerability that I think we can sort of develop a powerful solidarity. But it shouldn't just be some kind of essential story about identity. It should be about some political commitments.
Let's actually jump and talk about The Meaning of Freedom by Angela Davis, since you sort of already introduced us to it. In recent years, we've seen left political theorists and historians, all of whom have been on this podcast, Aziz Rana, Alex Gorovich, Corey Robin, engage in this project to recover the concept of freedom from conservatives and libertarians. What can the left learn by thinking with Angela Davis and the arguments she makes in this book in particular, in the Black radical tradition more generally, about the meaning of freedom? Where does that fit into this left project around freedom?
I think these sort of projects are important. This way, folks like, Aziz Rana and Alex Gorovich, have sort of been thinking about reclaiming the concept and practice of freedom. And it's important in part because, it does a kind of intellectual warfare, right, against, the sort of way in which freedom has been sort of terribly reduced, as you point out, to this sort of property owning individual, to the market, to this sort of libertarian sort of tendencies, this sort of vulgar insistence that, like, whatever we do in life, is sort of on our own terms, that we're at it alone.
And that's ultimately sort of a Jacksonian freedom to oppress others.
That's right. And I think, it's been incredibly damaging. It sort of inhibits our ability to sort of imagine, forms of life in which, freedom is sort of takes on, this sort of cooperative character, in which freedom sort of becomes like this sort of shared vision. That is a profoundly different freedom than the one we see, as you point out, in sort of Jacksonian configuration, this sort of Reagan-esque idea about freedom, as being something that is really just like about the sort of enterprising individual. I think that that's wrong, and it doesn't allow us to actually sort of, get clear about it does not sort of match what is going to need to happen in order for us to sort of confront, the problem of racial capitalism, to confront ecological devastation and climate change. And so we have to get clear about a different project. And so I think it's important. I think in order to sort of continue in that direction, we, say something about the ways in which the recovery, of the freedom project for the left, is actually not entirely an intervention that, has sort of taken place in the last few years. And so, like I think, Aziz, Rana, and Alex have written, profoundly important books. But it also seems to me that we should also think about the ways in which, just in the last half century, that the Black freedom struggle in particular has given us plenty of resources to think about what freedom entails. And it was happening at a time in which, in the 60s and 70s, in which freedom, the concept of freedom, was already being sort of radically reshaped by conservatives. And, this is what Angela Davis, was all about. And this is sort of at the heart of these lectures. And so, like, for example, in one of the lectures, she notes how taxpayers and ordinary citizens in Florence, Colorado, sort of banded together to essentially, raise money to purchase land, which they then donated to the California Bureau of Prisons, who then constructed, this $200 million prison compound. And this all happened because citizens, believed that the prison, would bring jobs to their community. Right. So this is a profound account that she's laying out about the ways in which a sort of freedom to find work, sort of becomes the basis for a profound incursion of freedom, right, which is directed at the mass warehousing of surplus populations. And that is the kind of story that raises questions about what a left freedom project, would entail, that is, not only committed to imagining, a sort of life of the commons in the context, of a kind of social democratic state, but it's also committed to sort of upending the carceral state, which so many, including Davis and other folks, understand to make any kind of democratic future impossible. And so there's this way in which, Davis and other folks are sort of thinking about the specificity of freedom and unfreedom in the post-civil rights moment that I think demands our attention.
It's just another reminder, as I've said over and over during this call, it's like, what could we have done if people had listened when these things were being said the first time, and not the 90th time and not the 100th time? You know what I mean? I think there's once again, that the silencing and the ignoring of radicals of color and indigenous radicals is really, it shows, I think, a problem insofar as we're experiencing things that could have been stopped or at least somewhat upended or slowed at the time when they were being called out the first time around, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why ignoring leftists of color and radicals of color is such a problem for our society as a whole. It's not just a problem for us, but it's a problem for white people too. White people fill those prisons too, right? And so it's important for us to recognize the ways that the things that people are discussing early on will eventually impact us. And it's unfortunate that racism is so powerful in this country that it silences people like Angela Davis, and it keeps her from being heard or at least taken seriously by scholars, even in her own field, when it's of the utmost importance to do so.
Wendy, speaking of freedom and fighting for it, you suggested a book that's been on my to-read list for quite a long time, but I have not gotten around to reading, which is We Will Shoot Back by Akinwumi Amoja. Why is this book important? What does upending this narrative of the good, nonviolent civil rights movement versus the bad, violent Black Power movement and kind of era of riots and uprisings, what does upending that dichotomy reveal about the actual history of Black struggle?
I mean, I think it's important that we get beyond that false dichotomy of good and appropriate versus bad and inappropriate forms of protest, because it allows us to finally center the actual reason for the protest, which is white supremacy, right? If we're going around blaming the protesters or people involved in the struggle, or even the victims, which is a common practice in the United States, then we miss the actual reason for the uprisings in the first place. And I think it distracts us. That preoccupation is one that's also a white supremacist preoccupation that distracts us from the real reasons that we're doing what we're doing. I also think that sort of the erasure and whitewashing of multiple approaches of resistance by marginalized groups, and I'd argue specifically Black people in the Americas, it sort of reduces the significance of Black resistance as a whole. This is something that we've seen people who discuss the Haitian Revolution talk about quite a bit about. So people like Michel Trujillo or Sybil Fisher, they've made this argument about the ways that the West, historically speaking, and just in popular culture, has overlooked the significance of the Haitian Revolution, at least at the time that it was happening. People were afraid, of course, of what this could mean for slave rebellions. But in terms of the historical record, they downplayed the Haitian Revolution as a revolution. It was framed as a riot. It was framed as just sort of a mass murder of colonists. But it wasn't seen as or read as a revolution within the normal historical understanding of what revolution meant. And this was precisely because the majority of the people who led and comprised the movement were, of course, Black, of African descent. They were enslaved. So it challenged sort of Enlightenment era concepts about what personhood was. And it excised, or at least the understanding of personhood did that, excised Black and Indigenous people in order to control their bodies and take their land for capital gain, respectively. And so I think that we're seeing a sort of similar dehumanization and dismissal of the intellectual capacity of protesters, and that includes rioters and looters, because it's much easier if Black people are continually shown as monsters, which sort of fits into the police narrative and the reasons that they're going after us in the first place, or this sort of trumped up idea of what Blackness is as a violent body. And I think in the process of dehumanizing people by virtue of calling protesters, rioters, and looters, we reinscribe that same problem over again. We reinstate those same myths that violence relies upon to justify. So a book like this, I think, is important for us to understand, or to read at this time, because it takes away all the myths about the quote unquote good protester, because basically the argument is there is no good protest without the quote unquote bad protester, right? The people who actually do respond to white supremacy and support people who are engaging in quote unquote nonviolent protests with a sense of self-defense, with the skills and the knowledge to defend themselves, because what they are facing is white supremacist terrorism. And the author is very clear about that. And also the other thing I just wanted to point out, going back to kind of the Pinho model as well, is that this book makes it clear that these methods of resistance are not coming from nowhere, right? They're not appearing out of thin air. He sort of the author traces the connections that are being made transnationally as well. And historically, over time, the ways that the slaves resisted, the ways that civil rights activists resisted, these things are not disconnected. And it's part of a longer tradition that gets cut off when we start dividing people into quote unquote good and quote unquote bad protesters.
And even the good, quote unquote good nonviolent protesters are only effective when they are in fact bad, because they are disruptive. And this Frances Fox Piven shows this very clearly, and I think this is really a moment for her right now. But she shows it very clearly in terms of the sit-down strikes in the 30s through the welfare rights organizing of the 60s, whereas liberals just have this idealized form of protest as this kind of like purely expressive.
And they're never good at the time, as you said, right? Like, even if we think about people like Colin Kaepernick, everyone was decrying his supposed defiling of the flag and violation of, the American tradition and whatever, and insult of the armed forces. And now you're looking at Roger Goodell again, sort of folded into this idea of capitalism trying to save itself, then saying, well, I was wrong about Colin Kaepernick, So it's interesting to think about when people are okay with quote unquote peaceful protests and when they're not.
Yeah, taking a knee, like the most modest sort of nonviolent protest imaginable, somehow construed as like almost terroristic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just gonna say, I mean, this good 60s. Yeah, so I think about this in the context of the civil rights movement, Black Power movement, right? Where you have this dichotomy between good 60s, bad 70s, right? And this is totally the result, of the sort of liberal retelling of the Black freedom struggle. And these middle class elites, they sort of have a vested interest in sort of telling this sort of sanitized story. But what is it sort of obscure, right? I'm sort of thinking about Brandon Terry, who's written this, this really excellent book, To Shape a New World, in which he says in the book, right, the relationship between violence and nonviolence is actually part of a sort of context of argument, or what he calls a sort of problem space. And so it's like, once we're able to sort of appreciate, this problem space in which, violence and nonviolence are actually sort of interacting in this really rich and sort of dialectical way, right, then we can sort of seriously confront the way in which, this is actually a sort of rich, sort of strategic and philosophical debate that was unfolding in the context of the Black freedom struggle. And so then it's like, what do we learn once we take seriously this problem space? Well, one, right, King actually never denies the existence of a right to self-defense. I mean, that's the first thing, right? Like, he never does. And also we learned that King had always sort of had his sort of eye trained on structural violence, the sort of structural violence of the state. He says in 1968, for example, right, like that I think the quote is like, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today is my own government. And we also learned that King sort of comes to appreciate the sort of coercive power of the riot. And we can see this everywhere in his thinking. But, just one example that just comes to mind is there's this moment, months before he's assassinated. He's having this conversation with Stanley Levinson and Andrew Young, Harry Belafonte. And Andrew Young basically is trying to explain away the problem by saying that, oh yeah, we can deal with this racism thing. It's not that big of a deal. And King he's angered by this. He shoots back. He says, no, the problem is the whole system. Right. And then he goes on to say that, like, I sympathize with everything the rioters feel. And so there's even these kind of narratives, like we see that the sort of good bad dichotomy actually sort of obscures the sort of historical complexity of what actually happened on the ground. And then the sort of final thing I'll say is that we can sort of see a kind of, as Wendy sort of pointed out, like a sort of interplay between violence and nonviolence sort of playing out today, right? So it's like, we have this influx, radical opinion in mainstream publications, sort of without an acknowledgement that one of the reasons, right, like that these opinions have sort of appeared, and one of the reasons that we've seen a sort of outpouring in the streets, I think, is in part because of the destruction of property. I mean, it just seems to me that there is a sort of unnameable thing that has sort of made the sort of insurgence of a kind of radicalism possible, right? Like, I can't imagine that we would be here if that precinct in Minneapolis were not set on fire. And so, so like one question is like, what would it mean to sort of name these sort of riotous acts, as the source of a kind of radicalism breaking through into the public scene.
Speaking of the prior era of Black radicalism and its somewhat surprising trajectory, another book you put forward, Jared, is Jackson Rising by Kali Akuno and Ajamu Nangwaya. Why is this book important? One thing that's remarkable about this book, but also the broader kind of movement from which the book emerges, is how it connects this older history of Black nationalism, the Republic of New Africa, with its origins in the North, I believe, Detroit maybe, to this very much alive present-day Black radical politics in Jackson, Mississippi.
So Chokwe Lumumba, who was the mayor of Jackson before, his untimely death, he starts out actually not wanting to be elected to office at all. Sort of he and other folks affiliated with this organization called the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, they sort of set out to organize the Black community in Jackson, as well as immigrants and poor whites. And they're interested in, sort of starting this organization, which is ultimately going to be called Cooperation Jackson. And what are they interested in? They're interested in what they call a solidarity economy, right? This is an economy that sort of links workers, consumers, housing cooperatives, urban farms into this sort of cooperative space that is all about the flourishing of the community. As you sort of point out and sort of how you sort of frame the question, they are in fact sort of drawing on a long tradition of struggle, Black nationalist struggle, to sort of free the land, which is how sort of Robin Kelly has put it recently, and that's actually been a sort of call of the organization, and they take themselves to be, very much in the tradition of another group that was sort of organizing in the 70s called the Provisional Government of the New Republic of the Republic of New Africa, and they were all about the sort of that sort of abolition of classless society. They were all about a sort of direct confrontation with the fact that so many of the members of the community had no control of resources, right? They lacked ownership over, sort of essential businesses and social infrastructures. They couldn't create laws. And, this coupled with the fact that the state could kill people and subject them to all manners of sort of structural vulnerabilities as it saw fit. And so Cooperation Jackson essentially was about, sort of recovering this vision of community power, perhaps unlike Republic of New Africa, the kind of sort of economic, I guess, cooperative Black nationalism, is actually not founded on the assumption of a kind of essential racial identity, which is very much a part of the sort of historical tradition of Black nationalism. So there is a kind of break. And so but there is actually something really imaginative about this too, because you have this organization that is, coming out of the, sort of Black nationalist tradition, returning again and again to some of the sort of precepts and principles of that tradition. But they nevertheless, they have this sort of universalist political imagination. And how is that, right? It's because of the political imagination. It's because at the heart of Cooperation Jackson, there's this idea that the capitalism is not going to spare black and white poor and working people in the city. And because of that assessment, the thinking is that, we need to band together and we need to insist on a kind of dignity.
Wendy, what lessons, both good and bad, can we learn from the Black nationalist?
So I think that's an important question, because lately what I've seen coming up a lot is the question of whether or not left's organizing is incoherent or incongruent with nationalist projects. And while I've seen an embrace, for example, of the Palestinian struggle, there's also a question of, like, on the one hand, there's an embrace of the Palestinian struggle fairly unequivocally by leftists. There's a debate of whether or not indigenous people have rights in this country to land, for example, and what that looks like as well for people of African descent who are descendants of slaves in this country. What do reparations or land access look like in a space that's still a settler colonial state? And so I think that the questions of Black nationalism, or questions that are raised by Black nationalism, sometimes run head on with leftist projects and or also other nationalist projects that are simultaneous and happening on the same lands. So I think it's an important question to ask. It's not one that I have any answers toward, or answers for, I should say. But it's one that I think is it's a debate that's being waged in real time. And especially, it even comes up in terms of, like, with regard to the Syrian struggle and things like that. It's come up multiple times. What does it look like for indigenous peoples to rise up and demand to be heard, demand land, demand rights and reparative measures when there's still a colonial project being engaged in real time?
Note for listeners that either right before this episode airs or right after, I'll be posting with Johanna Fernandez on her new book on the Young Lords, and we get into a lot of detail on the questions around revolutionary nationalism and how the Young Lords and the BPP very much saw that as part of a broader multiracial struggle against capitalism as well. And it's not quite the trade-off that I think a lot of people might sort of like simplistically impose backwards on at least the radical left currents of Black nationalism.
There's also the issue that comes up a lot as well as insofar as Black nationalism and other nationalist projects are framed as identity politics once again, and that serves as yet another conflict that I see sort of arising when we get into this discussion, because there are lots of Black nationalist projects that are inherently communists or fairly clearly left-leaning, and they're basing their autonomy on a sort of equity model that we'd be wise to take up as a nation. But I don't think, I think there's somewhat of a disconnect between those different sets of activists, and it's unfortunate because I think we could all learn from one another to do better.
The one thing I would add, in terms of, like, what can the left sort of learn about a project like Cooperation Jackson. So, I mean, it may be that that the kind of, sort of to some extent, the sort of political struggle will sort of primarily, at least in the short run, sort of be, at the sort of local and municipal level. It may be that the sort of building of the sort of anti-capitalist habits and sort of anti-capitalist social practices might sort of have to begin sort of when sort of where people sort of find themselves, where they're able to sort of potentially have the most sort of say in terms of shaping a sort of political struggle. So it's like after all, right, like, to some extent, the struggle for freedom or whatever is sort of going to be waged at the local level. It's going to be waged in the workplace. And it may be that, a project like Cooperation Jackson is just saying that perhaps we need to sort of just begin, to sort of become critical about the lack of control, that people have in their lives by sort of beginning at the local and municipal level.
Wendy, you also suggested the book Out of the House of Bondage by Thavolia Glimpf. Why is this book important? What do we understand about slavery that we otherwise don't when we incorporate gender and women into the history?
So this book came out fairly early. I believe it came out in like the late 90s. So it predates a lot of the debates that we currently have, where they are really engaging, in history at least, engaging the role of the female slave master or the female mistress, or the wife of the male slave master, and her role and control in the sort of domestic space in particular over the bodies and lives of enslaved peoples. So in that way, I think I chose this book because it's one of the earliest books to really go into this. And Thavolia Glenn sort of challenges Marxist readings of slavery, in particular with regard to the intricacies of the female slave experience as a quote unquote product or object, at least being seen as such, being a reproductive body as well. So producing more, having the reproductive potential as a slave who can give birth. I like this book, and I think it's an important book for us to read because it breaks down a lot of the presumptions about quote unquote solidarity that can be forged between Black and white women at this time. There was a myth, the myth of sorts, that because white women were so oppressed at the time, that they could empathize with slaves and thus could be potential comrades. And while that's nice to think about, it's not in line necessarily with the reality. I think that nowadays, again, I often touch on popular culture because I think it's where we kind of see a trickle down from academia into everyday discourse about these otherwise sort of topics that are kept up in the ivory tower or in books that people may not read. But I think it's important to think about the Karen, right? Or the Becky, or particularly the role of the Karen, because this idea of the Karen being the one to call the manager, the one to use to assert or exert authority by virtue of often relying on her white womanhood, right? And the sympathies that elicits. So I find that it's important for us to think about sort of the historical origins of something like that and understand that in this country we have a history. We can see a history throughout the construction of white womanhood as a foil to Black womanhood and the sort of social and economic consequences of that construction, that bifurcation of what white and Black means as it boils down to femininity and womanhood. The other thing that I think is really important about the book is that she talks in the second half about the way the struggles against enslavement were led by slaves themselves. We again, as I mentioned before, we talk about the Haitian Revolution in the United States, and we have discussions about revolution as waged, for example, within the Civil War and the like, but there's less of a real discussion about what slaves were doing at the time during the Civil War and how they were engaged in subversive activities, sometimes in the smallest of ways. And one of the things that she mentions is that, for example, enslaved women, once they were free or, gained their freedom through struggles of their own, they would take things like forks, knives, and spoons, because slaves were made in many cases to eat on the floor without any utensils. They would take clothing, curtains, all sorts of housewares and things like that. And it's something that these tiny details make you think about what resistance means in our everyday objects, and something that's very small, but that can be a symbol of hope and change. And I also think it's important to think about the beginnings, right? It's a reminder that things have to begin somewhere. And your new life may begin with a fork or a knife or a spoon or a dress. And it's seemingly inconsequential, but it's something that's very important to the bearer of this new object and the way it's refashioned by a formerly enslaved person and its meaning. And I think the book opens up a sort of symbolic discussion for us to think about now as we're engaged in brand new contemporary struggle of sorts, and what small victories we can have and how we can build upon them for much larger ones. But yeah, I think the main takeaway in terms of connecting present and past is with regard to not sort of hitching our horses to, or I guess being naive, I should say, to the prospect of allyship as well. And that's something that I think people like D'Angelo hopes that we ignore. And people like Glymph emphasize the structural inequalities and structural impediments to those potential solidarities.
So the last book that we're going to talk about briefly before we finish up is Golden Gulag, a classic on the political economy of mass incarceration by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who I'm hoping to have on to talk about just that book sometime in the next few months. Why is the book important? What does providing this sort of political economic analysis of the rise of mass incarceration in one of its geographic epicenters, California, at a moment that was really critical to its takeoff historically, the 1990s. What does that allow us to learn looking back to that time and place from here and now?
So first of all, I cannot recommend this book enough, not just because of the sort of substantive arguments, that she makes about, the sort of relationship between incarceration and political economy, which we can talk a little bit about, but also just because of the form of the book, like the way that, the book sort of comes out of her own sort of activist engagements, both as one of the founding members of Critical Resistance. The Critical Resistance is the sort of prison abolitionist group based and founded in California, and also because the book is basically coming out of the sort of study group that Ruth Wilson Gilmore, is sort of involved with, where these Black mothers are sort of working through and thinking about these laws that are responsible for the sort of mass warehousing of poor and working people. And, the result of this study is this book, Golden Gulag. And, one reason for sort of beginning with this praise about, like, the way that kind of social justice is sort of can be tied up in a sort of scholarly project is because, it helps us to sort of get clear about the sort of origins of the questions that she's raising, that it's not just about a sort of scholarly intervention, but she actually hopes to change the world along with folks around the country who are organizing against the carceral state. So there's a way that she's sort of connected to this problem, and you can sort of feel the sort of love and the sort of passion in the project, and you can sort of feel that she actually cares deeply about another kind of world. And so what is the basic argument? Well, the basic argument is that, have been these sort of prevailing assumptions about why prisons were being expanded in the state of California. And she basically says that, many of these assumptions are misguided in one way or another, or are incomplete, right? So this idea that prison expansion it's the sort of result of rising crime. She says that no, that's not right, because at the time of expansion, sort of massive expansion in California, crime was actually decreasing, right? She says that, there's this idea that, prisons were being expanded because of a kind of deepening drug epidemic, right? Because gangs were sort of heavily involved in drug trafficking. She also says, no, this isn't right, because it turns out that, drug use had been, on the decline, since the 1970s. And also because drug dealers, who were sort of being arrested and incarcerated were not being, gang leaders who were sort of being arrested were not being arrested because of some kind of like drug affiliation. And then finally, she's like, this idea that, prison expansion is a sort of straightforward racial cleansing story. She's like, no, that's also not quite right. Right. So the idea that prisons were the sort of new slavery, she says, sort of has to assume that prisons were actually being used as a source of unfree labor for private prisons. But that's actually not how things unfold, as she tells us, right? Most prisoners, on the one hand, are idle. And those who do work tend to work for public agencies that are not in the business of profiteering. And so now the question is like, okay, well, what is the sort of source of prison expansion? And she tells us, she says that, prisons are these like partial geographical solutions to political economic crises organized by the state, which is itself in crisis. It means that when the state has a kind of idle surplus, whether it's surplus land or surplus capital or surplus people, surplus populations, which is, by the way, the result of deindustrialization and dispossession, which she notes, the state needs to find stability for this kind of surplus. And how does the state do that? Well, as opposed to sort of doing some sort of deep reflection about, how to address the surplus, rather than doing some sort of deep reflection about, a kind of, broadening the sort of the social safety net, broadening the welfare state.
A social democratic fix to the contradiction.
That's right. What happens is California lawmakers turn to what they believe at that time can sort of manage the crisis. And what they believe can sort of manage, this crisis is our prisons. And that is a sort of profound argument, because it also helps us in our own time to sort of get clear about what our relationship, what the relationship of the people to the state is. It helps us to get clear about, what is the sort of outcome of the crisis of deindustrialization, right? Which can only be, as she tells us, the sort of policing and the mass warehousing of people, which is what happens in California, but it's a story that happens across the country, actually. And she tells us that story, I think, in a quite brilliant way. And it's this kind of engagement that I think, folks on the left should be reading, and reading quite widely and deeply.
And this is why defund police is such an expansive demand that immediately indicts the entirety of neoliberalism and the carceral state, and even, I guess, somewhat more nascently, the imperial state. Wendy, final thoughts on this? Final thoughts? I know you have to run.
No, I just had a quick question actually about Golden Gulag, because I haven't read it before. But when was it written?
It was written in 2007.
Okay, I was just wondering, where does she place the issue of incarcerated people being used as laborers so heavily now? So, for example, especially if we're thinking of the present moment, where you're looking at some of the only people who are employed, quote unquote, being incarcerated people who are working to get rid of the wildfires in California and Arizona and other parts of the country. How does that work for a warehouse population to be a productive population for capital, but not gaining themselves?
Well, I think the sort of central question that she's right. Like, so I don't think she sort of denies, the sort of role of a kind of prison labor in the sort of regime of the carceral state, but in California. But I do think she's sort of thinking, she's sort of trying to work through the sort of justifications for the initial sort of expansion of prisons. Not right. So I don't think it's a sort of commentary on, this idea that prisons are not sort of using the sort of labor of incarcerated folks. Rather, I think she's just like, okay, well, how is this sort of apparatus sort of working initially? What are the justifications that are being made for it in the state of California by these lawmakers? And I think that's the sort of source of her concern, rather than sort of trying to explain away the sort of story about labor productivity.
Yeah, it's more of a critique, if I understand correctly, of this kind of commonplace idea on the left, and I think amongst people in the United States in general, that mass incarceration political economic role is primarily a more kind of direct profit motive. You see all the kind of excess emphasis on private prisons, which outside of immigration detention actually play a fairly small role in the mass incarceration picture. So, Jared, is it right that what Ruthie's trying to do more is say, yes, it is about political economy, but maybe not in the way that you think?
Right. I mean, as a kind of, sort of rhetorical claim, like you've seen, I'm sure you've like heard activists who say like prisons are the new slavery. And, it's a powerful sort of rhetorical claim, in part because it sort of helps us to get clear about, the way that a kind of the sort of regime of domination, the regime of the racial state sort of gets produced and reproduced from the moment of chattel slavery, and it sort of gets reproduced after its sort of abolition. And part of what she's sort of trying to work through is sort of getting beyond the sort of rhetorical move to actually think about like what, at this sort of micro, sort of granular level, like what is sort of happening by way of the justifications that are made for expanding the carceral state. And it seems to me that, what she is essentially trying to get at is that there are reasons for the expansion of prisons in the state of California that sort of move a bit beyond, this sort of rhetorical claim about the new slavery.
Jared Loggins and Wendy Muse, thank you both very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jared Loggins is a political theorist of Black politics and a PhD candidate at Brown University. He is the co-author with Andrew Douglas of the forthcoming book, Prophet of Discontent, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Critique of Racial Capitalism. Wendy Muse is a PhD candidate in history at NYU and also the creator of the Left Pocket Project and podcast. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signaled the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We are posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis, music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinators are Julia Rock and Zachary Nin. Our senior advisor is Thea Riofrancos. Check out our vast archives at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at thedigradio, and do find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe. If it is on iTunes, you can also leave us a nice review. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. So does spreading the word to your friends. Please make propaganda for us. And do find us on Patreon and make a monthly contribution to keep this operation going. Even a few bucks is huge.